You're watching a lesson on implementing server virtualization with Hyper-V. Virtualization, there's a buzzword for you. It's everywhere, right? Or how about the cloud, right? These are things that you're going to have to get used to. It's not like if you've been doing this for a while, if you've been working with servers, going back for the last decade or two, things were a little bit more, actual physical boxes. Things are becoming more virtual now. Well, Microsoft's version, or I should say their implementation of virtualization, is something called Hyper-V. And so in this lesson, we're going to see how to implement Hyper-V using Windows Server 2012. Let's go take a look. Okay, so in order to demonstrate Hyper-V to you, what I thought would be the best way to go about this would be to show you the exact environment that I've been using for this entire course. And the reason is because, well, this entire course has been created in a Hyper-V environment. So what we're looking at right here is my actual physical server that I have here in my office. Okay, everything else we've looked at up to this point, we looked at our domain controllers or our member server or our client. Okay, these remote desktop shortcuts were actually taking us to virtual machines. Okay, and these virtual machines were created with Hyper-V on this specific server. Now, the first thing that I'll show you, and I can only kind of halfway show you this, is how you would install Hyper-V. So the bad news is I can only kind of show you because it's already installed. And the good news is, well, it's really, really easy, and you've seen this before. Okay, basically you go into Server Manager, and the reason we go into Server Manager is because Hyper-V is a role. So all I have to do is click on Add Roles and Features, click through this wizard the way we have with so many other things in this course, and basically right here you'll see that there's an option for Hyper-V. Now, if you haven't noticed, there's not much else I can do because it's grayed out. Okay, so I'm going to have to cancel out of this. That's why I say the bad news is I can't really show you how to install it. The good news is, hey, you know what to do. This is the same as any other role that we've installed throughout this course. Now, once it's installed, you will get a utility called the Hyper-V Manager. So if I click on the Start button on my keyboard, pulls up the Start screen, and you'll see that I have a Hyper-V Manager. And I will also show you, let me hit Start again, to go back to my desktop. I pinned the Hyper-V Manager, that's this icon right here. I pinned it to my taskbar. And the reason I pinned it there is because I knew I was going to need to go to it a whole lot as I was going through this course. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and click on Hyper-V Manager. Here in the Hyper-V Manager, you can see, and just to ignore this here on the left, this is ed-w2k12. Okay, well, my name is Ed, and this is Windows Server 2012. I know, you go ahead and laugh at me the same way I have laughed at other people. 2K12 is nothing shorter than just putting 2012. So it's just kind of habit from doing 2K3 and 2K8. So I did 2K12. But anyway, so that's what this represents here. This is the name of the server that I'm actually working on. What I see over on the right are my virtual machines. And here you'll see NYDC1, NYDC2, NYMem1, and Win8 Client 1. These are the virtual machines that I used throughout this entire course. Now, if I wanted to create another virtual machine, well, it's actually quite simple. All I have to do is right-click on my server, select New Virtual Machine. And I get the New Virtual Machine wizard. And I get a Before You Begin screen, which is just your real basic, hey, this is what's you're about to do. You see this in all sorts of different wizards. Go ahead and click on Next. Now I can give this virtual machine a name, so I'm just going to call this Demo VM, okay, because this is not something that I'm going to use anywhere other than this particular lesson. By default, when you first set up Hyper-V, and I'll show you this in just a moment, but you establish a default location for your virtual machines. And you can see it here. It's grayed out though. Okay, on my D drive, in a folder called Hyper-V, I have another folder called VMs. And that's where I store my virtual machines. So if I leave this open right here, I'm going to go ahead and click Start to get me into the Start screen. And I'm going to click on Computer. And you see on my D drive, I have a folder called Hyper-V. And then there I have a folder called VMs. And as long as we're looking at this, I will show you that I also have a folder called VHDs, which stands for Virtual Hard Disks. Okay, we'll look at that in just a moment. And then DVDs. And this is where I keep my DVD images for any of the particular virtual machines. You know, if I need to mount the ISO image, which is like inserting a DVD into the drive, well, I have them all in one place here. If I go into my VMs folder, you'll see that I have a virtual machines and a snapshots directory. And we're not going to go into great detail from this direction. We will come back and revisit this through the Hyper-V Manager. If we take a look at VHDs, here we can see all the various files, and that's what's very cool about virtualization. These are just files that represent virtual storage. Okay, you may remember from the local storage lesson that I had mentioned that there's also something called virtual storage, and that we would cover it in this lesson. Well, virtual storage is very cool because it's a file. Okay, this right here is a file. It's a hard disk image file that represents the hard disk for the Windows 8 client virtual machine. If I go into my DVDs folder, again, just showing you these are my ISO images, and these are actually, this is both Windows 8 and Windows Server 2012, and it's two different versions. That's all it is. When I first started playing around with this course and getting this course ready for you, we had not had the full release of Windows Server 2012 or Windows 8 yet. So I was using a pre-release, and then once it came out, I went ahead and grabbed the real thing. So that's what these ISO images are. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close out of Explorer there and jump back over to where we were in our new virtual machine wizard. What I was saying was you can pick your default location, but if you decide for whatever reason this particular machine needs to be located somewhere else, you simply check the box saying I want to store it somewhere else, and then you pick where you want to put it. Okay, but the defaults are that you're going to keep all your virtual machines in the same place, and that is a good practice. So I'm going to go ahead and click on Next. Now we need to assign memory. How much memory or RAM do we want to give to this virtual machine? And the decision has to do with, well, depending on what operating system you're going to install, and then also what are you going to do with the machine? Okay, so there is no one correct answer to what I would put in the memory here. It's a matter of understanding what the machine's requirements are. So just to take, pretty much any machine these days, a standard machine, probably you should have somewhere in the area of 2 gig of memory. So I'll put 2048 megabytes. And you'll notice it says that that's startup memory. Okay, and this has to do with a concept that was introduced late in Windows Server 2008. If you went to, I believe it was Windows Server 2008 R2, I think you even had to go further than that. I think you had to go to Service Pack 1. You could get paging memory. And I will tell you, I could be wrong about the exact level of where you could get that in Windows Server 2008. But what I can tell you is in Windows Server 2012, we have this, which is where we're really just setting the minimum memory needed to start up the machine successfully. We can use dynamic memory, and when using dynamic memory, this allows the machine to make a request for more memory if it's running out. Okay, so this virtual machine can make a request to the host computer, okay, the computer that I actually have physically here in my office. If there's more memory available, dynamic memory allows this virtual machine to make a request for more when it needs it. So this is actually pretty cool stuff, the paging memory and the dynamic memory, because with the original versions of Hyper-V, if you go back to Windows Server 2008 or further back, the problem was you had to truly guess how much memory the machine needed. And you always would find yourself in a situation where either you underguessed and then the machine didn't perform very well, or you would overguess, which is what was done more often than not, right? You didn't want slow performance, and memory didn't cost that much, so we just went ahead and said, well, I'm going to give it too much memory because then I know it'll do its job. But then you were wasting it. Okay, now this is a lot better because we can much more efficiently use the memory on our system. I'm going to go ahead and click Next. Now here is where you set up networking, and you're only going to be able to do this if you have networking set up on the host. Okay, so that's something else that I'm going to show you how to do. But I do have networking set up on the host, and I will show you that I have these 3 possible networks. And I'm not going to go into great explanation about them other than to say, look, these 2 are both private, set up for a specific circumstance. And I will also tell you that those private networks have nothing to do with anything I've done in this course. It was something else I was doing when playing around with this particular computer. Whereas this guy right here, this points to the actual external connection of the physical computer. And this is the one I have been using throughout the course, and that's why I've been live in every capacity. If I needed to get out to the internet, I could go out to the internet. Anything I needed to do, it was live. Now, we'll talk more about networking in a little bit. Now I need to assign the virtual hard disk, right? We were just talking about this. Virtual hard disk, this is virtual storage. So the name, it defaults to the name of the virtual machine. Not a bad idea, because as you saw in that folder, all of the virtual hard disks had names that I could quickly and easily recognize what machine those disks went with. I want you to note the extension here of VHDX, whereas older versions of Hyper-V would be VHD, and we will talk about the differences between those two, which is primarily size difference. We'll take a look at that in just a moment. But VHDX is brand new to Windows Server 2012. You'll see there's a default location, which we already looked at. And then what I've been doing is I've been assigning 200 gigabyte hard drives to each of my virtual machines. Okay, that's what I had created for each of my virtual machines that I used in this course. There was nothing specific about that. That's just something I happened to pick because I knew it was large enough to satisfy the needs of what I wanted to demonstrate. If you have an existing virtual disk in place, you could just point to that. Or you could say, hey, I want to create this machine without a virtual disk and I'll attach it later. All right, so you do have the option of really doing whatever you want, separating what you do with virtual storage from your virtual machine itself. So I'm going to go ahead and do the 200 gig, and we'll create that now. Click Next. And this is where I get to choose what am I going to do as far as an operating system. I can choose to install it later, which I will tell you is what I do 99% of the time. I will explain why in just a moment, but I want to go through these other choices. I could choose to install an operating system from a CD, DVD, ROM. So if I have, let's say, Windows Server sitting in the actual physical DVD ROM drive on this computer, I could do that. Or I could point to an image file where I would find that. This is going to seem extremely out of date, but you could install the operating system from a boot floppy disk. All right, so I guess if you're creating a virtual machine with an older operating system that you can still boot off floppy, go right ahead. Or you could also install your operating system from a network-based installation server. Now, why do I do this one? The reason I install an operating system later is just from experience. I don't have anything to 100% validate why this works the way it does, but in my experience, when you choose to install the operating system as part of the creation of the VM, maybe I just have bad luck, but I have about a 50-50 success rate. It fails all the time during installation. Whereas if I say don't put an operating system on, I'll add it later, I have a nearly 100% success rate. And I will also tell you that I'm not alone in this. I have a number of coworkers, associates, friends, whomever, who have come to me and said, hey, Ed, I'm trying to create this virtual machine and I'm following the steps and the operating system doesn't seem to want to install when I do it as part of the creation of a virtual machine. And every time I give them the advice, install it later. And you'll see, by the way, how easy it is to install later. And it just works. So I'm going to go ahead and click Next and Finish. And it'll go through, and it's pretty much configuring this virtual machine. And there it is. I now have my demo virtual machine. Now, I said that I would show you how to install the operating system later, so let's just do that right now. If I right-click on Demo VM and go into its settings, right down here on IDE Controller 1, which is my DVD drive, all I have to do is put, of course I got to go to my folder where I know I've stored all my DVDs, but put the image of a DVD. So I'm going to go there, and let's say I wanted to do Windows Server 2012. I put that image in the drive right there. On top of that, I can also check to see if there's anything else that needs to be changed, like right here, the BIOS says it's going to boot from CD. Well, that's good, right? Because we want it to boot from the CD so we can get the operating system installed. We have 2 gig of memory. That's good. Now here with the dynamic memory, look, we have our minimum and our maximum amount of memory. Now, if that maximum might be bigger than you want it to be allowed to ask for, so you can put a maximum on there. If I go to my processor, you'll see here that I can select a number of virtual processors. Okay, and in this particular computer, I have up to as many as 16 processors available to put onto this virtual machine. Okay, in other words, the physical machine that I'm using, it has dual quad-core processors. So I have 2 quad-core processors, so that's 8 processors, and each of those processors are hyper-threaded. And so double that and make it 16. Okay, so we do have the ability if we want to add additional processors, and I will tell you that I've been doing 2 per virtual machine. Makes it run like a nice dual-core processor computer, which is enough for what we were demonstrating here in this course. You'll see that I do have some other resource control capabilities. We won't go into that right now. Here's our hard drive we already set up. We have our DVD drive, our network adapter, and some of the rest of this I will save for just a little bit. But the bottom line is if I click OK, now that I've verified everything is in place the way I want it, all I have to do is either right-click and select Start, or instead of right-clicking, I will show you that if you highlight, you can click Start over here, or you can go up to the Action menu and click Start over here. There's a lot of different ways of doing it, but when I do, it will go ahead and start the machine. You'll notice it went from an off state, like we have on these 2 down here, to a running state, like our domain controllers are. So now it's running. And you can see in this little tiny thumbnail down here that it is booting. If I want to see that in something bigger than a tiny thumbnail, all I have to do is either double click on this virtual machine or right click and connect. And when I do that, it opens up and shows me, and look at that. It booted right into the Windows Server 2012 installation wizard. If I go ahead and click on Next and Install Now, that's all there is to it. It's going to install the operating system. And when I say that's all there is to it, it's still all the same steps that you would need to do when installing Windows Server 2012 on any other computer. I'm saying, but that's how easy it is. And that's why I don't feel the need to go ahead and install it during the creation of the VM, especially since it seems to have about a 50-50 success rate. Now I want to show you something. If I close this window, so I'm going to click on the X right here, I haven't closed the machine. I haven't done anything to the machine. It's still running, and you can still see it down here. And if I connect back up to it, well, it's right back where it was. But a couple of other things I could do this machine, if I come up here to the Action menu, and I will tell you besides the Action menu, there's also buttons right here. I like using the menus because then there are actual words written, so I know for sure what I'm doing. You'll see here that I can save. Well, first of all, let's even go a step below save. Let's go all the way down the bottom here. If I reset, this means it's going to reboot the machine. If I pause, it's just going to literally pause the machine right where it's at. If I save, then what it's going to do is it's kind of like a pause in the sense that it's going to, actually I'll tell you what the best description of save or the best analogy of save would be. It'd be like it's hibernating it. It will save its state into memory, but then truly shut it down. If I do a shutdown, this is something that I don't even know if I could do at this moment because of the state that I'm in, but this would be doing a proper shutdown of the computer. It'll actually go through and do a proper shutdown, whereas turn off means I'm physically just turning it off, which is what I'm going to do right here. I'm going to turn off and say yes, turn it off. You obviously don't typically want to just turn off a virtual machine, just like you don't usually hit the power button to turn off a physical machine. The only reason I did it here is because I'm not going to go through any more of that installation process on that virtual machine. I was just creating it for you. Now over here on the right, you'll see that there are some Hyper-V settings. If I click on those Hyper-V settings, this is where I can establish the default location of things like your virtual hard disks and your virtual machines. Now there are a number of other things that are more advanced than what we're going to get into in this lesson, but I will tell you that this is where you go ahead and establish those default locations for your virtual machines and your virtual hard disks. Now, let me take you a little bit further here, and let's look at the actual settings of one of my existing virtual machines. Okay, and I'm going to intentionally go to one that's running. Okay, so I'm going to take New York DC2, go to its settings, and I want to look at these bottom settings, right? We looked at most of these top settings. Let's go down to the bottom. You see here, integration services. It says select the services that you want Hyper-V to offer to this virtual machine. To use the services you select, you must install them in the guest operating system, and they must be supported by the guest operating system. In order to install within the operating system, well, let me show you that. Let's go ahead and connect to New York DC2 and do a Control-Alt-Delete. Now, you see I can either click the button here, or I can go to Action and Control-Alt-Delete and put in my password. And once I have the system installed, right, I have to have the actual operating system installed, on the Action menu, I can insert the Integration Services Setup Disk. And what it's doing is there's an image, there's an actual image out there of a disk that represents these integration services, and it's putting it in the virtual DVD drive. Okay, you'll see right here that it says DVD drive D, Integration Services Setup, tap to choose what happens with this disk. And that's a Windows Server 2012 thing. That's what pops up. It's kind of like the old auto run as far as what would pop up. I'm not going to do that. What I am going to do is I'm going to go ahead and just take us into the computer and then show you, here it is. What you would typically do is I either could have tapped that button and then ran setup, or if I just double click on it, it will then pretty much go ahead and auto run with the setup. Okay, so it says that a previous installation of Hyper-V integration services has been detected. Click OK to upgrade. So what this is telling me, and I'm going to go ahead and click cancel. Okay, we don't need to install integration services. By default, when you install Windows Server 2012 on Hyper-V on Windows Server 2012, you get a certain version of integration services. It is recommended that you do upgrade to the latest and greatest version, though. Okay, this is an older version, and now there is a newer version. The only reason I'm not going to do it here is because there's nothing that is going to be given to me that I need to worry about. Now, what is it that I can get with these integration services? Let me go ahead and close this window, and let's come back over here to the settings. So you get these 5 choices. You have operating system shutdown, which allows the Hyper-V server to initiate a graceful shutdown of the guest virtual machine. And we're also going to look in a moment how and why that might happen, besides you asking it to happen. We have time synchronization, which allows the virtual machine to use the host server's processor for the purposes of time synchronization. Now here's a big one, data exchange. Being able to exchange data quickly and easily back and forth from the host to the virtual machine. Without the ability to do data exchange through integration services, the only way to get data to or from a virtual machine would be if that machine is on the network, and if you were to create a shared folder, for instance, and then you go ahead and connect to the shared folder. So you're not directly exchanging data to or from that virtual machine. You're getting it across the network just like you would any other machine. Data exchange allows you to do a simple drag and drop, as well as allowing the Hyper-V host to do things like write data to the registry of the virtual machine. Heartbeat. This allows Hyper-V to determine if the virtual machine has become unresponsive. And then finally, we have backup. This allows the volume shadow copy service provider to create snapshots of the virtual machine for the purposes of backup operation. And it does this without interrupting the virtual machine's normal operations. All right, so it's important that you have integration services, and the older the operating system on the virtual machine, the more important these integration services are. Okay, I mean, like I said, Windows Server 2012 on a virtual machine, on Hyper-V, on a Windows Server 2012 machine. You know what? I did this entire course without ever updating integration services beyond what was there by default. Now, I mentioned with regards to shutdown that I was going to show you something here. If I scroll down just a little bit more, we have this thing called automatic start action. What do you want this virtual machine to do when the physical computer starts? Okay, so pretend like the actual physical host is not on right now. Maybe we had a power failure, or maybe we just had some kind of major maintenance shutdown that we had to do. Now we've gone ahead and we've booted the system back up. What do you want this virtual machine to do? You could tell the virtual machine to do nothing, which means you don't want it to start unless you actually come up and manually say, I want you to start. The default setting is automatically start. Aha. So if this virtual machine was running when the host computer was shut down, well, then go ahead and bring it back on again. Kind of makes sense, right? If it was on before, bring it on again. And then there's always start this virtual machine, which means whether this machine was running or not, when the host comes on, start up this machine. We can also do a delay if we find in some instances the host machine has other processes that it needs to get up and running before this machine starts. There's also the scenario where there may be another virtual machine that you want to have start first. For instance, maybe you want your domain controllers to come up before other servers come up. So you could put in a delay. And then we have an automatic stop action. And you'll notice, by the way, that these are grayed out. And the reason they're grayed out, it says some settings can't be modified while the virtual machine is running. Okay, so let me go ahead and cancel out of here. It's because we're looking at New York DC2, which is running. If I were to jump to New York Mem1, which is off, and go into its settings, when I scroll down here to the automatic stop action, you'll see it's not grayed out. So what do you want this virtual machine to do when the physical computer shuts down? Now, this would be obviously if the physical computer is doing a proper shutdown. I mean, if you have a power failure and your backup battery has just died and boom, you just lost power and it's gone and it shuts down, obviously the virtual machine can't really do anything. There's no time for it. This is if you're doing a proper shutdown. You can choose to save the virtual machine state, you could choose to turn off the virtual machine, or you could choose to shut down the guest operating system. Again, remembering the difference between turn off and shut down is turn off is like physically turning it off, just boom, hit the power button, whereas shutdown is do a proper shutdown. So these are the automatic start and stop things that you can do with your virtual machines. Now, if I scroll back up here to our virtual hard drive, okay, here I have this virtual hard drive that was created for New York Mem1. And, well, I'll tell you what, the first thing I want to point out right away is that's fine that I can see the location of the actual disk, but I'm also noticing that edit is grayed out, and it's because we have snapshots in place. All right, well, I think now is as good a time as any to talk about snapshots then. We'll come back to virtual hard drives. I'm going to hit cancel, and I want to show you that NY Mem1, there was a snapshot taken. And if I want to take another one, I could right click and just select snapshot. And when I do that, it goes ahead and it creates another snapshot. And a snapshot is just what it sounds like. It pretty much is taking a picture of what this machine looked like right now. And then if I made some changes and I didn't like those changes, or maybe we were having some kind of a corruption issue or something just wasn't working, well, all I have to do is just select a snapshot and then apply it. And it will bring the machine back to the state it was in when that snapshot was created. All right, so that's something very cool with using virtualization. Matter of fact, I will tell you that I have systems at home that I personally run my host operating system for the sole purpose of just running virtualization. In other words, it's kind of weird because it's just one computer, and on that one computer, I will just have one virtual machine. But what it allows me to do is to have this flexibility of quick and easy backup and recovery. And it's pretty much foolproof. I mean, it's almost 100% foolproof. And I say almost because nothing's 100%, right? In the sense that, these days, we used to have something called, well, we still have it, something called system restore, right, where we created a restore point, which was almost like these snapshots. And this is not in virtualization. We're saying in the actual operating system. Windows XP first introduced this. We had system restore. And then you'd get some kind of a nasty virus, and you'd say, oh, I can fix that real quick and easy. I'll just do a system restore to before I had that virus. The problem is these days, some of the viruses have gotten smart, and they figure out how to attack the restore points. Well, I'm not familiar with any viruses that are smart enough, and again, they might be out there, and I'm just not familiar with them, but any viruses that are smart enough to figure out how to get from the guest operating system where the virus was caught onto a snapshot, which is being managed by the host. Now, yeah, if the host gets a virus, that's different. But why would the host get the virus? If the host is running Hyper-V, and for the sole purpose, meaning you don't do anything else with the host, you do everything from within a virtual machine, and then something bad happens to that virtual machine, and you take regular snapshots, boom, just go back to a snapshot anytime you want, problem solved. Now, why do I do this at home? Let's see. I think you heard me mention this in a previous lesson. I have 4 children. Matter of fact, I'll take it a step further and I'll say I have a wife and 4 children, and I'll clarify that the wife is self-admittedly not very computer literate. So between my wife and the 4 kids just doing anything and everything that they want to do on my living room computer, guess what? They break it a lot. And I kind of got tired of having to go in and fix it manually or rebuild it manually. So now I can fix it quickly and easily with these snapshots. All right. So now let's go back and look at our virtual hard disk. What I'm going to do is I'm going to jump over to demo VM, this one that we just created, because I know there's no snapshots for that one. And go into the settings, and right here, go ahead and highlight the hard disk. You'll notice now I can edit it, right? It's showing me, here's the actual VHDX file. If I click on edit, we will see that I can compact it, I can convert it, or I could expand it. Now, the main thing that I want to do is talk about converting. A number of different things that we can do here. First of all, if I click on next, I can choose if I want to go to a VHD, which supports hard disks up to 2040 gigabytes in size, or a VHDX file, which supports up to 64 terabyte sizes and is resilient to consistency issues that might occur from power failures. So the point is these new VHDX files are more resilient and allow for larger hard drive sizes. I'll go ahead and click on next. We're going to leave it at VHDX, by the way. There aren't too many reasons that you would want to go to a VHD. The reason I point this out to you is because if you have a virtual hard disk that maybe you brought over from a Hyper-V server that was running Windows Server 2008, it'll be a VHD file. Here's how easily you can convert it to a VHDX. I'll click next. This is where I can choose either a fixed size, and this means, remember that 200 gig, that we created for this? Well, it's going to actually tie up 200 gig of hard disk space on my host computer. Or I can do what's called dynamically expanding, which is where it'll only use up what it needs as it's getting full, and it will grow until it maxes out at 200 gig. Then from there, the only way that we would be able to add more is if we were to expand it, which was another option. If I click on next, this is where, again, I can select the name and location just as we've done before. And I'm not going to do anything here, okay, because we're not actually going to be converting anything. I just want to show you this wizard. And you see what's next is simply the summary. So I'm going to cancel out of here. Now, another thing I want to show you, let me go ahead and cancel out of here. I'm going to jump over to this Win8 Client 1. Yeah, there's no snapshots in that one either. This guy is also a 200 gig drive. When I click inspect, I want you to see what it shows me. It shows me that it's a VHDX file. It shows me that it's a dynamically expanding virtual hard disk. It tells me where it's at, what the file name is, And notice that even though the maximum side is 200 gig, it's currently only tying up 15 gig. In fact, I could have done this even with the running machines and with the machines that have snapshots in place. Okay, so let me do this here just to show you. The only thing I can do, because this one's running and it has snapshots and everything's grayed out except for inspect. Look at this. This is New York DC1. It's only 2 gig. I'm only tying up 2 gig of hard drive space. That's my domain controller and a bunch of other things that we've done throughout this course. Okay, so I just kind of wanted to show you that that's what the VHDs look like. Now, the last thing I want to do before we wrap this up is I told you a long time ago, way back near the beginning of this lesson, and I think I said something like in a few minutes. Well, I think I lied because it's been more than a few minutes. But I want to talk to you about networking in Hyper-V. If I come up here to my host, right, this is my actual computer, and I right-click and go to Virtual Switch Manager. And again, I could have also done it over here on the right. Okay, so I go to the Virtual Switch Manager. This is where I can create those virtual switches. And by the way, this is what was previously known as virtual networks. Okay, that's the old term was virtual network. Now it's called a virtual switch. Here you can see the 3 that we already have, right? The private network 2, and then the actual physical network card that's on the host or external network. You'll also notice that when I highlight this one, it shows me this is the external network going out via a specific network card. Whereas if I click on a private network, you'll see that it says private. If I want to create a new virtual network switch, I can do external, which we just saw. I can do private, which I will tell you, external is just what it sounds like. You're using the actual network card from the host, and you have full external access to the outside world. Whereas if I do internal, now each virtual machine is able to communicate with any other virtual machine on this Hyper-V server, and it can also communicate with the host itself. Whereas private is almost the same thing. Private means that the virtual machines can communicate between each other, but that's it. They can't even communicate with the host. Okay, so depending on what type of a network you're setting up and what the purpose is going to be for that network, you go ahead and set up the appropriate virtual switch. As we saw earlier, when you create the virtual machine, you then point to one of these virtual switches. And we can also look at this by going into the properties of a virtual machine. Okay, I said properties, but of course the selection is settings. I always think of those as one and the same, properties, settings. And you'll notice that on the settings here, here's the network adapter. And this is where I can choose which virtual switch I want to be connected to. From there, once you have established the general idea of networking, as far as am I going to be able to communicate with the outside world, am I going to only be able to communicate with other virtual machines and the host, or am I going to only be able to communicate with other virtual machines, we can then go a step further and we can use VLANs, right? We can use virtual LANs to go ahead and create multiple virtual networks within this virtual switch. The other thing that we can do is we can also do a little bit of bandwidth management. All right, so I will tell you that that is, the basics of using Hyper-V in Windows Server 2012. And it is something that you're going to want to be familiar with because it's the way computing is heading. Everything is going to be virtual. And even when things aren't virtual, take my home environment where I just have a very basic computer. And I will tell you, by the way, on the home computer, one recommendation I might make for you is instead of using Windows Server 2012, you might use Windows 8, which also has Hyper-V built into it. Either way, it's fine. I'm just saying if you don't have Windows Server 2012, maybe maybe you're just using evaluation copies because the server operating system is expensive, and maybe you do have a license for Windows 8, well, you can just do it right in Windows 8. But like I said, even in my home environment, even though I'm not saving on resources or anything like that, right? I'm just using a single physical machine to run a single virtual machine. That's still what I'm doing for the simplicity of backup and recovery. And I will tell you that I've toyed with the idea. I've just never gotten around to doing it, mostly because I don't use that computer at home often enough, as far as myself personally. What I was going to do is I was going to actually create two virtual machines, one for everyone else and one for me, which meant that not only could I recover that machine, but it also meant that even beyond truly, destroying the machine where I have to repair it, I don't need all the kids' applications getting in the way of what I'm trying to do. So, if the day ever comes that I need to start sharing the machine with my kids, well, there's another reason to create virtual machines, even at home. Okay, so virtualization is something that you're going to see anywhere and everywhere going on into the future.
And so that brings us to the end of this lesson. And, other than obviously some actual basics that you learned on installing Hyper-V, the one main thing that I want you to take with you is an understanding that virtualization is everywhere and it is the wave of the future. So you're going to want to make sure that you have a good, firm grasp on, how to work with it. Well, that's all I have for you. I'll see you in the next lesson.